Hello. My name is Udelin Sloan. Yes, that's Sloan. And if you're watching this, it means my family's little empire is about to go up in flames. You want scandal? Try being erased from your own legacy while your sister builds a throne from your silence. This isn't a story about betrayal. It's a story about what happens when the quiet one finally stops waiting to be invited in and starts flipping every table in the room. The second the elevator doors slid open, I felt it, that tightness behind my ribs, like my body already knew something my mind hadn't caught up with. The air in Langston Tower carried that sterile chill of too much glass and too little truth. It smelled like money and decisions made behind closed doors by people who smiled with their teeth, not their eyes. I stepped out onto the marble floor, heels tapping into a silence no one else seemed to notice. Cameras were being set up at the far end of the corridor, cables snaking like veins. And there she was, Isolde, my sister. Her blazer was tailored, her hair effortless, her smile precisely measured for optics. Looking back now, I should have seen it coming. She waved at someone across the room, then turned just enough to acknowledge me. Not a hug. Not even a full turn of her body, just enough for the cameras to catch a sliver of sisterly civility. When I reached the check-in table, I saw the name tags laid out alphabetically. Isolde's was centered, gold-rimmed, crisp. Mine was printed smaller, off-center, slightly smudged, like a formality someone almost forgot to order. That's where it all started. A reporter called out, "Can we get the Sloan sisters together?" Isolde turned, all performative grace, and grabbed my hand. She smiled so wide it looked painful, then leaned in, just enough for the flash to catch us mid-embrace. Her nails dug into my palm. "Try not to embarrass us today," she whispered through clenched teeth. I didn't flinch, but I felt it. The warning, the possession, the threat behind the softness. I caught a glimpse of the digital banner rotating behind us, Sloan Legacy Merger. Her name was bold. Mine wasn't there at all. I didn't know what was waiting for me next. We were ushered into the boardroom. A young legal assistant handed out bound copies of the merger documents. I sat near the corner, not assigned, just instinct. Isolde took center. I flipped through the pages, my eyes scanning each section. The financial models I'd spent months drafting weren't there. My name wasn't listed under founding contributors. The section on third-party audits, the very one I authored, had been replaced with a single line, internal review streamlined. I raised a hand slightly. "Where's the third-party auditor section?" Isolde didn't look up. "We streamlined it." Streamlined. That's a polite word for deletion. My fingers felt cold. I turned one more page just to hide the way they trembled. No one else noticed. No one ever does. That moment changed everything. A cousin entered just before the doors closed. She was loud enough for her voice to carry. She's only here because their mother made everyone keep her involved. I froze. My feet didn't move, but my breath caught mid-exit. The ringing in my ears swallowed every other sound. I haven't been forgotten. I've been erased deliberately, politely, thoroughly. My hand tightened around the folder, its edge pressing into my palm until the skin split slightly. A thin line of red. The only real thing in the room. That's when I stopped expecting an apology. The chairman of the board glanced up. "Are we ready to begin the merger prelude?" Isolde smiled. "We're fully aligned." Aligned. That word sat in my mouth like metal. I glanced at the seating chart displayed discreetly near the podium. Isolde at the head. 2 board members beside her. My name placed far right, marked as silent partner. A quiet understanding settled into my chest. I was never meant to belong here. I was only meant to comply. Looking back, I think that was the moment I let go of the idea that playing nice would save me. Someone came around collecting duplicate name tags, some kind of security protocol. The assistant removed the extras and walked off. I watched as mine was tossed into the trash without pause. The sound it made, soft plastic hitting metal, felt louder than any insult I'd ever heard. A board member leaned toward Isolde. "You'll carry us through the announcement as always." My throat tightened. I wasn't choking. I was realizing they had rehearsed this, scripted it. I was never part of the scene. Just a footnote that looked good on paper until it didn't. I sat down slowly, the polished wood beneath my hands cool and detached. The sunlight hit the table just right, and my reflection looked blurred, incomplete. Maybe I was never meant to be in the picture. Maybe they only needed my signature, not my presence. My fingers hovered over my phone. I didn't know why. Instinct, maybe. Muscle memory of reaching for something, anything that still felt mine. Something inside me whispered, "If they won't make room for you, take back the room." The courage found me before I realized I'd been summoning it. It rose with a quiet strain in my chest as I walked back into the side lounge, the kind of room where conversations happened only when they benefited someone with a stronger voice. I stepped inside, waiting for the faintest shift in air, a glance, a nod, anything that said I mattered. Nothing. Not even the sound of my heels cut through the low hum of indirect conversations. I moved past a cluster of junior associates without interrupting their rhythm. Their laughter stopped only when one of them leaned closer to another and whispered, "She's just holding the title. Real decisions go through Isolde." My breath stayed steady, but something warmer curled beneath my ribs. Not anger. Not yet. Just recognition. This was how erasure worked. Not in one dramatic cut, but in 1,000 small edits no one else seemed to notice. My name tag sat flipped on the counter, its plastic edge catching the overhead light. I picked it up, tracing the bent corner with my thumb. There was a weight in that tag, heavier than it looked, like holding the truth of where I stood in this family and realizing no one intended to shift it. I didn't realize it then, but that moment changed everything. A coffee machine hissed softly in the background as I stepped closer. The warmth rising from its metal surface touched my fingertips, grounding me for a second. I thought about how many years I had played my role the way they trained me to: quiet support, silent labor, background strength. I lived in the blind spot they created for me, trying to convince myself it was home. So when the next thought arrived, sharp as a pin under my skin, it startled me. I am done being convenient. I am done being the person they reach for only when something needs to be fixed for them. That's where the first crack formed. A memory surfaced, uninvited but stubborn. 1 year ago, at the Sloan estate, the dining room was loud with stories no one finished and jokes that tumbled over each other. Isolde sat at the head, a glass of wine in hand, gesturing like she was conducting an orchestra that adored her. My plate sat untouched. No one noticed. Not until the housekeeper leaned in, her voice gentle. "Would you like me to reheat this?" I smiled, grateful, but the knot in my chest pulsed again. Even kindness felt like an apology for someone else's neglect. I tried to swallow that truth, just like I tried to swallow the cold food, but both stuck in my throat like something meant to be spit out, not swallowed. I didn't know what was waiting for me next. A burst of conversation pulled me back into the room. Isolde was speaking with a private investor, her voice warm enough to melt the frost she kept for me. "It's fortunate you thought of the expansion pitch early," he told her. I paused mid-stride. That pitch, the very one I'd mapped out on my dining table weeks ago, the one she dismissed as unpolished, was now her talking point. She didn't stumble. She didn't hesitate. "Timing is everything," she said, her smile as smooth as lacquer. My hand tightened around the cup I hadn't realized I'd picked up. Not even my ideas were allowed to arrive in my own voice anymore. I could feel that realization settle like a stone inside me. Hard, impossible to ignore. That's where it all started. A digital panel on the wall updated with tomorrow's schedule. The names rotated in slow rhythm, like a silent reminder of hierarchy. Isolde's name was bold, centered, positioned as though the entire event orbit around her. Mine sat beneath in smaller font, labeled Silent Partner. Silent. That word burrowed under my skin. There was nothing silent about years of labor, late nights, crisis management, and the endless cycle of fixing what others broke. But silence was what they wanted from me now, a role I never auditioned for, but somehow kept being cast in. I didn't know what was waiting for me next. Something in me hardened. I reached for the small tag on the counter, the one someone had flipped without care, and slipped it quietly into my coat pocket. It wasn't about the name. It was about refusing to let them toss away one more piece of me. I took out my phone, typed 2 words to Thalassa. Do you still have the copy? I hesitated for a fraction of a second before sending it. If I was invisible to them, then perhaps invisibility could be my advantage. That's where the shift began. As I tucked the phone into my pocket, Isolde walked past me with the same grace she used at every family event. She stopped long enough to rest her manicured hand on my shoulder, the gesture rehearsed from decades of knowing exactly how to show dominance without ever raising her voice. You've always been such a team player, she murmured, smiling for anyone who might look. Don't complicate that now. Her hand lingered, warm, heavy, familiar, suffocating. I remembered that touch from long ago, under the hospital blanket when our mother lay fading, when Isolde pretended to be the supportive sister. Now, it felt like a leash disguised as affection. Looking back now, I should have seen it coming. The next time she touched me like that, it wouldn't be for comfort. It would be to steady herself when everything she built started to collapse. I didn't raise my voice. I raised my standards. The courage I had claimed only minutes earlier settled into my chest like a new kind of gravity. It didn't lift me. It pulled me deeper into myself, where the truths I had ignored for years finally had room to breathe. I stepped out of the lounge and down the stairwell into the parking level, needing air untouched by the performance upstairs. The concrete smelled damp, a mix of exhaust fumes and winter cold. I took out my phone and dialed Thalassa. It rang twice before she ended the call, her way of saying she heard me. Her silence meant she understood. I wouldn't have reached for her unless something irreversible had begun. I didn't know what was waiting for me next. The hum of the ventilation shifted, reminding me of another hallway, another year. It pulled me back 22 years, to Savannah, when Isolde and I were barely out of college and still pretending the world couldn't bruise us. Our mother was in treatment then, thin and soft-spoken, telling us to take a walk and breathe air that isn't hospital air. We wandered the riverfront that afternoon, the heat sticking to our skin, and stumbled into a tattoo shop advertising specials. We were impulsive, or maybe we just wanted to feel permanent in a world that kept changing around us. We chose matching marks, the Sloan sigil, and below it, 2-1, our childhood code meaning, I've got you first. Looking back now, I should have seen what loyalty meant to her. When I stepped into the private restroom lounge that afternoon in Langston Tower, I saw Isolde at the mirror touching her wrist lightly, as if checking a pulse. But the ink was gone. In its place was smooth skin, the faint blur of a laser fade. She didn't cover it. She erased it the same way she had been erasing me from every document, every room, every frame that could have held us both. That's where it all started. A burst of applause echoed from the hall, sharp enough to pull me out of that memory. I followed the sound and saw a crowd gathered around the lobby's giant screen. The merger tribute video had begun. It was filled with company milestones, smiling executives, and family portraits meant to look candid. Slide after slide passed, each one a curated version of truth. My father shaking hands with investors. Isolde cutting ribbons at openings. Even old holiday photos resurfaced, polished for public nostalgia. But not one frame of me. Images I knew existed, ones where I stood right beside her, had been cropped so precisely the air beside her shoulder looked cleaner without me. I watched my absence repeated over and over, like someone had decided my presence caused discomfort they no longer wished to pretend away. I didn't realize it then, but that moment changed everything. When the final slide faded, I saw Isolde standing among a cluster of board members, laughing like the world always rose to greet her. A director clapped her shoulder and said, "You've carried this legacy flawlessly." His words sliced through me faster than I expected, because I had carried some of that legacy, too. In the unseen hours, in the paperwork no one praised, in the damage control she took credit for. But scars never make the slideshow. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. Neither of us blinked. The weight between us was anew. It was simply louder now. That's where the truth started to settle. I stepped closer, not enough to draw attention, just enough for the words to reach her without a witness. You know I was there. In those moments, whether you show me or not. My voice didn't shake. If anything, it sounded steadier than I felt. She chuckled softly, tilting her head the way she used to when she pretended to be amused. People remember who speaks loudest, Eudalin. You chose not to. She wasn't wrong. I had been quiet for them, for peace, for the illusion of unity. But there was a difference between choosing silence and being sentenced to it. That's where the shift became unavoidable. I walked away before she could add anything else. My steps carried me toward the elevator, the polished floor reflecting a version of myself I hardly recognized. The elevator doors slid open with a faint chime. Inside, the light was softer, almost gentle compared to the brightness outside. For a moment, I stood alone with nothing but my reflection and the question rising beneath my ribs. When did I start believing my voice needed permission? I didn't know what was waiting for me next. I pulled out my phone. My fingers moved with a certainty I couldn't explain. I opened the encrypted folder I had created years ago, back when I still believed documentation mattered even if people didn't. Sloan Internal Docs, Original Contributions. Every file there told a story they hoped no one would read, spreadsheets, audit reports, expansion models, drafts stamped with dates long before Isolde ever presented them as her own. If my existence wasn't part of the official story, I would begin writing the version they couldn't edit. I highlighted the first PDF and hit forward. What they buried with my silence would resurrect with my proof. The email left my phone with a soft vibration, and for a moment I just stood there in the hallway, letting the air settle around me. It didn't matter that the message took seconds to send. What mattered was the years I had spent swallowing my voice to keep the peace, and the single decision that finally broke that pattern. My steps carried me forward before my mind fully caught up, guiding me toward the legal suite at the end of the corridor. When the read receipt pinged, a quiet confirmation flashed across my screen. The notification didn't give me satisfaction. It simply reminded me that something inside me had shifted into place. Looking back now, I should have realized this shift wouldn't stay hidden for long. The hallway lights seemed brighter than they had an hour earlier, almost clinical in their sharpness. A legal assistant stepped out of the prep room holding a stack of printed materials for tomorrow's announcement. When he saw me, he hesitated for just a moment before handing me a packet. The glossy cover featured a full-page portrait of Isolde, chin lifted, eyes bright, every detail polished. I flipped through the pages slowly, each turn revealing a spread designed to showcase her as the embodiment of the Sloan legacy. My face wasn't anywhere. A director approached, adjusting his tie in that nervous way executives do when they're pretending to be kind. "Marketing felt your tone didn't match the aspirational image we're going for," he said gently, as if he were comforting a child who didn't understand why she didn't make the team. I nodded stiffly. Translation: I looked like someone who worked, not someone who performed. That's where it all started. The phrase Phoenix strategy caught my eye near the bottom of one page. My breath tightened, and a memory rose uninvited. 5 years earlier, I sat at my kitchen table, stacks of financial models spread out like puzzle pieces. Isolde had told me to draft a turnaround plan, something bold, something that would carry the company through its unstable quarter. I poured myself into it, fueled by espresso and the belief that family collaboration meant something. I titled the file Phoenix_turnaround_V3 because I hoped we could rise from the mistakes that weren't entirely mine. I emailed it to her at 2 in the morning. Now the phrase lived beneath her photo, trademarked and stylized, part of her narrative. That moment changed everything. I walked deeper into the room, and the noise dropped to a low murmur. Isolde stood by the refreshment table, surrounded by executives who mirrored her expressions like disciples. When she saw me approaching, she didn't step away from them. She just shifted enough so I had to move around her, not through her. "You didn't even bother to change the title," I said quietly, stopping just close enough for only her to hear. Isolde didn't blink. "If you cared that much, you'd have spoken up 5 years ago. I was busy holding things together so you could pose on top of them." Her smile softened into something colder. "No one likes a martyr, Eudalyn. They like a face that sells." Her words didn't sting the way they once would have. They landed with a dull thud, like hitting ground you already knew was dead. I wasn't looking for her approval. I wasn't even looking for recognition. I just needed her to stop pretending she wasn't standing on the work I'd built while insisting I stay invisible. I didn't know what was waiting for me next. I stepped away and found myself staring at a wall of tinted glass that separated the prep suite from the rest of the floor. My reflection stared back, tired eyes, set jaw, the kind of expression born from years of quiet endurance. I lifted my chin slightly, studying the woman who looked back at me. For the first time, I wondered if bravery looked less like shouting and more like refusing to look away from your own truth. That's where the shift deepened. My pulse steadied as I walked toward a door at the far end of the room, the executive legal suite. I hadn't used my clearance for that room in years. Isolde told me once, half joking, half warning, "You don't need to worry about what happens in there. Leave that part to me." And I did, because I thought trust was the same as loyalty, and loyalty would eventually be returned. The camera beside the door glowed softly, tracking movement. I raised my badge and swiped. The lock clicked open with a mechanical certainty, and the door eased inward. They gave me clearance thinking I'd never use it. Let's see how silent they want me to stay now. Inside that room were documents they never thought I'd understand, let alone use. The moment I stepped inside the legal suite, the air felt different. Thinner, sharper, almost metallic, as if the truth itself had been waiting for me behind that door. For years, I'd walked past this room without slowing down, trusting what others told me was handled. Now, the silence inside felt like an invitation I had been too timid to accept. I closed the door gently behind me, letting the latch click into place. The room was empty, just rows of color-coded folders arranged with surgical neatness, each one containing decisions made in my name without my consent. I didn't realize it then, but that moment changed everything. A folder lay open on the central table, like someone had left in a hurry. My eyes landed on a signature at the bottom of a document, a limited power of attorney form. My name looked perfect on the page, smooth and sharp, but something about the curve of the E fell off. I leaned in closer, scanning for the metadata tag at the bottom. The timestamp didn't match any login I'd used. It didn't even match a day when I had been in the building. They didn't forge it with care. They forged it with confidence. My pulse didn't spike. Instead, it steadied, as if my body finally aligned with a truth I had refused to name. They believed I would never check. They counted on my silence the way a thief counts on a locked door no one bothers to try. My breath left my lungs slowly, not in shock, but in a kind of quiet resolve I had never allowed myself to feel before. That's where it all started. My phone buzzed softly. A message from a number I hadn't seen in years, a former mentor, someone who had once told me I brought structure to chaos. The message was short. I saw the doc. I'm sorry. I didn't push back when I should have. I stared at the words for a long moment. They weren't apologizing for participating. They were apologizing for assuming I wouldn't notice. It was an admission wrapped in fear. Fear of being connected to the fallout that was now unavoidable. I didn't feel gratitude. I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity, the kind that settles in your bones and whispers, "You were right to doubt them." I didn't know what was waiting for me next. I stepped back into the hallway just as the sun dipped behind the skyline, casting a muted glow across the frosted glass. The Alasas stood near the far end, her posture straight, her gaze calm, a quiet presence in a world full of noise. When she looked at me, there was no surprise, no hesitation. "Do you still have the certified original?" I asked. "I never deleted your mother's instructions," she answered. Her voice carried the steadiness of someone who had watched an entire family play out their worst habits and chose to stay silent until the right person asked the right question. "They're sealed, time-stamped, notarized." A small breath escaped me when I didn't realize I'd been holding. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about punishing Isolde. It was about restoring myself to the place I had been pushed out of. It was about truth. Not as ammunition, but as reclamation. That moment changed everything. I walked back into the suite and set my phone to silent. My fingers moved with a deliberate calm as I drafted 3 encrypted emails. One to an external auditor who owed me a favor after I'd bailed him out of a compliance firestorm. One to a financial oversight contact who knew how to read between the lines without being told. And one to a journalist I once protected from a lawsuit Isolde nearly weaponized. Each email was precise, factual, documented with attachments no one could dispute. With every line I typed, something inside me settled deeper into place, like a puzzle resolving itself after years of being forced into the wrong shape. If I did this, I couldn't pretend anymore that I hadn't seen what they were doing. But if I didn't, then I deserved every piece of myself they had taken. I didn't know what was waiting for me next. I hit send all. The screen dimmed for a moment as the messages disappeared into the ether. Outside the window, the wind pressed against the glass, its tremor soft but insistent, like the building itself felt the shift. When I stepped back into the hallway, the mirrored wall beside me caught 2 reflections converging for just a moment, mine and Isolde's. She didn't notice. She kept walking, heels crisp, shoulders squared, the world still moving the way she expected it to. This time, I didn't need her to see me. I just needed the law to. Tomorrow, they'd call it betrayal. But I would know it was the beginning. The morning didn't greet me so much as push me forward, the way a cold gust nudges a door that was already cracked open. I woke before the sun, the kind of waking that doesn't rise from rest, but from anticipation. My phone glowed on the dresser, a single notification waiting like a breath held overnight. The auditor's reply opened with one green checkmark and 5 words that rearranged something deep inside me. Confirmed. Illegal authorization present. My pulse didn't spike. It settled. They always assumed I'd go quietly, as if dignity were a leash and silence, some form of gratitude. They never once considered what I'd do when the leash snapped. Looking back now, I should have realized they mistook my restraint for weakness. They never understood that quiet isn't empty, it's gathering. That's where it all started. By the time I reached Langston Tower, the winter sky had begun to dim, even though the day had barely stretched its legs. The building hummed with the false warmth of celebration. Sloan Group's 60th anniversary tribute. Cameras. Velvet curtains. A stage set to honor a legacy that had been edited until only one sister was left standing in the spotlight. I entered the pre-meeting hall just as a velvet box was brought to the center podium. A board member cleared his throat, wearing that bright smile people use when they're selling sincerity they don't feel. "This," he announced, lifting the lid with ceremony, "is the keepsake your mother wanted the rightful heir to have." Inside was the locket she had pressed into my palm years ago with the words, "This is for when you forget your worth." And yet here it was, in someone else's hands. They handed it to Isolde. "She always said Isolde carried her grace," the man added with a reverent tone that made my stomach tighten. I felt my lips curve into a small smile, not out of agreement, but out of recognition. Mother also said, "Grace is what you offer when you've been robbed of credit." That memory brushed against me like a warm hand on a cold day, reminding me that truth has a longer lifespan than flattery. I didn't realize it then, but that moment changed everything. Isolde lifted the locket for the cameras, thanking everyone with that polished cadence she used at charity galas and board dinners. Applause rose around her like confetti. I didn't join in. I just watched, hands steady at my sides, letting the noise wash past me as another memory surfaced. My mother sitting at her old desk reading poetry aloud. "If they ever forget you," she murmured, "remind them without raising your voice." I took a long breath. This wasn't the moment I disappeared. This was the moment they learned what silence can accomplish. That's where the shift deepened. The official press event began shortly after. The moderator invited the Sloan sisters to the stage, a phrase that still felt incorrect, as if the title belonged to only one of us. I followed Isolde toward the podium, the lights hot against my skin. She leaned in toward me, her smile as bright as polished glass. She wanted a picture for the papers, a narrative of unity. I extended my hand. She paused, just long enough for the cameras to catch it, and whispered, "Someone like you isn't worthy of my handshake." Her words sliced through the air, quiet enough for only me, but sharp enough to draw metaphorical blood. A faint nervous laugh trickled from the crowd. I kept my hand suspended for a breath, then let it fall gently to my side. No flinch.
No stumble.
Just clarity. She didn't humiliate me. She documented herself. I turned to the moderator with a calmness that felt like borrowed steel. "Shall we begin?" I asked, as if nothing had happened. As if her insult were a fly brushing against my sleeve instead of the culmination of decades of slow erasure. I didn't know what was waiting for me next. As the presentation moved forward, my gaze stayed level, my breath steady. I watched Isolde speak with the confidence of someone who believed the ground beneath her feet could never shift. She didn't notice the change in my posture or the way I held her gaze longer than usual. But the room felt it, a subtle tightening, a shift in equilibrium. That was the moment I realized I no longer stood in her shadow. I stood beside it, unaffected. That's where it all started. My phone vibrated once on the table. The screen lit up with a subject line that felt like the quiet click of a fuse being primed. Clause 8.3 activated. Withdrawal pending. My hand rested lightly on the table, calm and deliberate. She reached for legacy today. I reached for leverage. One of us was about to discover what real power looked like. They thought the war ended with a smile. They forgot what happens when you humiliate someone who knows exactly where the fuse box is. I didn't come here to win. I came here to end the part of me that still waited to be invited. Inside the executive war room, the air was different. Less oxygen, more urgency. The kind of room where power usually wore cologne and made eye contact only with those who could outlast it. Today, however, power was unraveling fast. Papers shuffled with the desperation of people trying to delay consequences. Screens blinked red. Legal aides leaned into their laptops with wide eyes and dry mouths. I stepped in without speaking. I didn't have to. Isolde was on a call. Her voice, always smooth and bright like showroom polish, now cracked between words. "It's not a liquidity issue," she said to someone, probably an investor. "It's a communication lapse. We're stabilizing." The man nearest the screen turned. "We're down 18%. That's what it sounds like when power realizes it no longer owns the floor." I didn't blink. I moved closer to the projection screen where a compliance officer, visibly pale, tapped his stylus against a specific clause in the merger agreement. "This line here," he said, clearing his throat, "authorizes auto transfer of Silent Partner shares into the family's executive holding." He hesitated. "It has Udolin's name attached, but the signature isn't valid." Silence collapsed over the room like a dropped curtain. They didn't just erase me. They attempted to bury me in their success and hoped I wouldn't feel the soil hit my back. Looking back now, I should have seen it coming. A junior analyst's voice sliced the silence. "We've got a drop, 22% now." The stock ticker on the far wall blinked rapidly. Sloan Industries. Down. Down again. A red arrow angled like a blade. And then came the replay. The handshake moment from earlier. My hand extended. Her refusal, the smirk, was now being rebroadcast on national financial media. The headline below it read, "Boardroom Breakdown? Merger Shaken by On-Camera Attention." There it was. The price of arrogance. Measured one decimal at a time. I didn't realize it then, but that moment changed everything. Isolde spun on her heels and faced me. Her words came fast, too fast, like someone trying to outrun a truth that already knew where she lived. "You did this. You burned down your own family name." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "No," I said. "I finally stopped handing you the matches." Her jaw locked. I saw the tremor start in her left hand, the one she always used to point when she needed to dominate a room. Behind her, a board member sighed heavily. "We warned you, Isolde," he said, not loudly but clearly. "Over-leveraging legal authority always backfires. You just made it personal." She turned toward him. "I was trying to hold this company together." No one replied. That's where the silence shifted. My phone buzzed again. Investor relations froze all active assets. Legal counsel withdrew. A line of messages appeared across the shared dashboard. Emergency board vote initiated. The sentence she built for me was now folding around her. She glanced at the screen, at her name next to mine in the clause she tried to bury. The digital ink was still there, cold and factual. But now, no one would pretend it wasn't theft. I didn't gloat. There was nothing left to enjoy in her fall. I turned to the window. Charlotte's skyline looked like a calm painting from this height, still, distant, detached from the wreckage inside. In the mirrored glass beside me, I saw one reflection. Mine. Isolde was gone. It didn't take revenge to destroy her. Just the removal of the shield she thought I'd always be. That's where it all started. Another vibration. I looked down. The auditor's message read, Clause 8.3 withdrawal complete. Funds rerouted. Confirmed. She wanted silence. I gave her an audit. Now it was time to give them the ending they wrote, with me edited back in. The boardroom felt half evacuated when I stepped inside, like a party that ended 10 minutes too early. A few chairs were empty. Some faces looked ashen, not from guilt, but from the realization that the cameras were still on and the narrative had slipped out of their control. I walked to the center of the table, removed a small flash drive from my coat pocket, and slid it across the glossy surface. It didn't click. It didn't thud. It just landed, soft, precise, undeniable. I didn't need to raise my voice. Not when the truth played louder than I ever could. The screen behind them flickered to life. Grainy footage began to roll. No dramatic music, no voiceover, just the hum of a home video and the image of my mother in her robe, seated in the sunroom of our old house. She looked tired, older than I remembered her at the end, but still firm in that way Southern mothers had when they were done making room for other people's comfort. Her voice was raspy but clear. Eudalyn deserves the keys. She always carried what the others only posed with. A sharp inhale cut through the room. One of the board members stood up quietly and slipped out. No one followed. Then another voice came through, not my mother's, but Mary, the housekeeper who had worked for our family for 3 decades. She was off camera, but her words were steady. She left the locket for Eudalyn. I placed it in the envelope myself. I wasn't going to say anything, but it's wrong to let them lie. That moment changed everything. Isolde didn't move. Her fingers, perfectly manicured, stayed frozen around the edge of the chair. I didn't know what was waiting for me next. The door behind me opened. Thalassa entered without ceremony, holding a slim leather folder. She crossed the room like someone delivering a verdict, not a favor. Without speaking, she placed the document on the table and stepped back. This is the certified will, she said. Unaltered. Filed before the amended copy. Isolde blinked rapidly. That was replaced. Not legally, Thalassa interrupted, her voice even. You know it wasn't. Silence doesn't always arrive with weight. Sometimes, it arrives as oxygen finally returning to a room. This wasn't revenge. It was the removal of the rewrite. I looked down at the folder. My mother's handwriting still sat in the margins. She hadn't asked me to fight for this. She'd simply assumed I'd be too tired to. That's where it all started. My phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a lawyer or an auditor. It was a financial alert. The headline was short but seismic. Zencor announces $800 million infusion, led by former Sloan investor E. Darrow. The screen behind us updated. Sloan Group Holdings delisted. They thought I would die without their table. They didn't see I'd built another one. I didn't realize it then, but that moment changed everything. Isolde rose from her chair slowly, her shoulders square, but her voice uneven. She walked toward me like someone who had rehearsed a speech and now couldn't remember the lines. This was supposed to be ours, she said. Her voice cracked on the last word, like she hadn't said it aloud in years. I didn't step back. No, Isolde. This was always a mirror. You just never looked close enough. There wasn't anger in my tone. I didn't need it, because in that moment, I saw her for what she was, not a villain, not a mastermind, just a woman who believed the reflection she'd curated was real. I don't hate her. I don't need to. The world she made will now speak for itself. I gathered my things quietly. No one clapped. No one stood. There was no announcement.
No headline.
Just the sound of my shoes on the polished floor and the echo of a story they thought they could edit without consequence. There's no roar in justice. just the echo of what was silenced finally being heard. Peace didn't come in applause. It came in the silence that finally felt mine. 3 days had passed. Not much had been said, but everything had changed. I pulled up to the Sloan estate alone, the tires crunching softly over the gravel drive. The gates opened without anyone needing to buzz me in.
Habit, maybe.
Or muscle memory, even for places that once rejected you. The staff didn't greet me when I stepped out. One looked up from trimming hedges, then quickly returned to his task. I didn't blame them. The house had become a monument to discomfort, too quiet for its size, too polished to be warm. There's something sacred about returning to a place that once spit you out and no longer needing it to love you back. I walked through the front entrance and past the library, where the scent of leather-bound silence still lingered. In the sunroom, I found my grandmother sitting by the window, wrapped in her favorite shawl, the one she said made her look like she had opinions even when she didn't feel like sharing them. She didn't flinch when she saw me. Her hand reached out, thin and freckled. I took it gently, expecting maybe a question about the storm that had just hit our name. But instead, she just smiled. "You remind me of Marianne," she whispered. She always stood taller than people thought. I didn't correct her. For the first time, being called my mother's name didn't feel like a shadow. It felt like a passing torch. That's where it all started. I stayed there with her for a while, letting the late morning light crawl across the rug like it was unhurried for once. She dozed off, eventually, her breath light, her grip still curled loosely around my fingers. Back in the study, a folded newspaper sat on the table. I already knew what it said, but I read the headline again anyway. Former Sloan CEO removed from all financial boards, ethical breach cited. The article didn't name me. It didn't have to. Isolde's LinkedIn had been scrubbed.
No interviews.
No statements. Just silence. The same kind she used to weaponize, now returned to her without warning. This wasn't prison. It was exile by exposure. A sentence that never needed a gavel. I didn't know what was waiting for me next. Back at home that evening, I drafted a letter for a nonprofit I'd quietly supported for years, the Forgotten Foundation, a place that helped women who had been cut out of family companies, partnerships, promises. I didn't tell them my full story. I just sent a check with a note that said, "Use this to build rooms they won't be left out of." My mother's voice echoed in my mind as I sealed the envelope. "If they ever make you feel small, don't shout. Rise, and they'll shrink on their own." I didn't just reclaim my name. I repurposed the wound. That moment changed everything. Later, I walked to the lake. The one I used to visit with my mother before things got so complicated, so corporate. I sat on the bench she favored, the one that faced west, so she could watch the sun disappear without needing to explain why that mattered. In my hands was a photo. Not from the boardroom, not from the news. Just a faded piece of paper with my handwriting, the original blueprint I made for Sloan's first audit. The one no one asked me to make. The one I gave freely because I thought that's what families did. I never wanted to be the loudest voice. Just the one they couldn't ignore forever. A breeze moved through the trees, just enough to rattle the branches, but not enough to carry anything away. It reminded me of something my mother once said when I was young and afraid to speak in class. You don't need to be loud. You just need to last. That's where it all started. A young woman walked by on the path, slowing when she recognized me. Her eyes widened. "Excuse me," she said, hesitating. "Are you the woman from the Sloan thing?" I smiled, not wide, not for effect, just honest. "I'm the woman they forgot. Until they couldn't." Justice didn't need to roar. It just needed a pulse strong enough to outlast the noise. Sometimes the loudest justice isn't the one you fight for in court. It's the one that happens quietly, when the people who erased you are forced to explain your absence to the world. If this story made you feel seen, if it reminded you that dignity doesn't require permission, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been written out of your own story? Tell me in the comments. Subscribe if you believe some legacies are louder when built in silence. And stay with me. There are more stories coming that prove you don't have to scream to be unforgettable.